Moonshine has long been a part of Ozark history and folklore. It's a folk craft and a folk tradition that was very strong among the people of Scottish-Irish descent. The making of whiskey, a well-honed craft in the old country, exploded here in the 1920s and 30s because of Prohibition, and the Depression fueled the fire under many a still. Today, the art is almost lost because it is not being passed on to further generations. Many believe that moonshine will be done altogether within 10 years. It would be rare to stumble upon a moonshine still today, but 60 to 70 years ago, it was a different matter. Stills were so common, it was said all one had to do to find one was march upon any spring branch and poke around for a while. One man says, "You have to have an insight on everything. In the winter, you couldn't buy 1,000 pounds of sugar without somebody getting suspicious. The grain we could buy alright because we had hogs and cattle." This was especially true because cops got most of their tips from people buying bulk supplies of corn. Another difficulty with moonshine is keeping the smoke down. People would be able to notice where a moonshine still was if they could see smoke billowing into the air. The answer to this problem was to use wood that was as dry as possible. This created less smoke and made the stills more inconspicuous. An opening in the top of the still was covered by a wooden whiskey barrel called the thump keg and sealed with bread dough. When the fire was going full force, pressure inside the still created a deep, muffled thump that could be heard hundreds of yards away. This is how it got the name the thump keg. It can be thought to be like an amplifier. It's got a muffled noise that sounds like thunder from a long distance, and it occurs every 8 to 10 seconds. An insulated double barrel removed final impurities. At the end of the operation was a condenser, a coiled copper pipe called a worm in the hill vernacular. The end result was a steady stream the size of a pencil. This would constantly keep one man busy just changing the jugs. Making the moonshine was just the first step to making a profit. It had to be transported discreetly to buyers. Moonshiners would hire people called bootleggers to hide the moonshine and transport it. The name bootlegger was used because originally they would hide moonshine in their boots to transport it. One moonshiner said that to lessen the risk of getting caught, the bootlegger they hired to take it to Tulsa, Oklahoma, was one who knew both sides of the road, so to speak. He was retired from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and knew how to distribute it and such. During Prohibition, moonshine was so popular in the Ozarks that at one point in time, a local man offered $10 to anyone who could find a house between Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and Gateway, Arkansas, where it wasn't at. There's no telling how much illegal liquor flowed, but by one estimate, those pencil-thin streams swelled to a river of moonshine. The now defunct Licensed Beverage Industries Incorporated, which represented legal distillers, said that between 1950 and 1969, 1 billion gallons of moonshine were produced nationwide. Most of it was produced in the Moonshine Belt, a strip of southern states led by Georgia, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Tennessee. Good whiskey sold for $1.50 a pint. That's $12 a gallon, and therein lies the reason that moonshine flowed like a river. Corn was worth more by the gallon than the bushel, these men say, and making it had as much to do with depression as prohibition. A lot more moonshine was made for personal use than for sale in the Ozarks, though. But whatever it was for, moonshiners continued making it long after Prohibition ended. In fact, in the 40 years that followed Prohibition, 6,000 stills were seized by federal agents in Arkansas and Missouri. Moonshiners were usually on friendly terms with the sheriff, and even those who got caught never held a grudge. But to federal agents, moonshine was not a game. Your average moonshiner, in our judgment, is not a nice guy back in the hills, Federal Agent Holman says. Between the 1920s and 1983, 196 agents were killed in the line of duty. The majority of that was in the 20s and 30s. Busting stills at the local level could also be dangerous, pointing to his side where he says he was once hit with a shotgun blast. He recovered, but says he still carries some of the lead pellets below his skin. Despite such dangers, moonshiners often saw the sheriff as a neighbor, Holman says, unlike the federal agents who were seen as outsiders. The sheriff, he says, usually learned of stills by word of mouth. Another bootlegger or another moonshiner would tell on his competition. People thought it was good people turning them in, but it wasn't. It was other moonshiners. Moonshine may well be the stepchild of Ozark crafts today because it is fading. Visitors at Silver Dollar City can see soap and candle making, apple butter making, and more, but there is still no still. At the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, visitors can watch a mill grind corn, but they can no longer watch a still turn it into moonshine. The still that was once part of the park's cultural display was taken down because it gave people the wrong impression of the Ozarks. There was a still for a short time, says Kay Thomas, the crafts director at the park, but the state agency that lent it to him eventually took it back. Despite the fact that generations of moonshiners are passing away, and despite the fact that there is not an effort to be made to preserve the skill, no one will say that the thumping the heartbeat of the moonshiners has stopped entirely. The majority of it is probably just made for novelty. But as far as it is for making it for profit, those days are gone. If there's a lost art in the Ozarks, it's probably making decent moonshine whiskey.